The first thing that I learned in this class was the importance of outdoor learning. Bringing your students outside reduces their stress levels, increases their levels of concentration, forces them to utilize their five senses, gets their eyes off of any harmful screens, and it even betters their overall physical health. Just like an indoor classroom, I learned that classroom management is still very important. Before you explore nature with your class, make sure to introduce them to new and fun concepts while also establishing classroom rules. You can also spice up your vocabulary to turn a rainy, gloomy day into an exciting hunt for ducks. On the first day of class, a guest teacher took the reins. She exhibited fantastic lingo and positive talk throughout her lesson. Before heading into the forest, she made every student knock on an imaginary door and ask the animals permission to enter their home, ultimately making sure that nothing in nature would be disturbed. Getting students to effectively use their five senses is very important to achieve. Once outside, you can have students observe their surroundings. They can observe birds' nests high up in trees. They can feel the texture of lichen and tree bark. They can smell the pine scent in evergreen trees. They can hear woodpeckers, and they can even taste the freshness of the air. While teaching fourth grade, I used this habitat survey so students could utilize their five senses and observational skills in order to determine optimal habitats for animals. It was set up like a scavenger hunt so students could collaborate with one another and eventually give their habitat a final score. During one of our indoor class sessions, we asked students to draw habitats that they interact in while in school. When instructed, Dr. Faust's daughter began coloring her entire paper black. She told us that this represented the blacktop that she plays foursquare on every day during recess. One type of learning that I did not have a chance to incorporate into my lesson plans was inquiry-based learning. In class, we learned that this forces students to explore and ask questions using their own personal observations. Teachers can guide them by having them answer prompts such as, I wonder, I notice, it reminds me of, or I think maybe. In class, we learned that once students have begun to inquire and master basic outdoor observational skills, one activity that can begin to challenge them further is creating their own dichotomous key. This directs students to observe known characteristics about multiple different organisms. They can skillfully differentiate these characteristics and ultimately understand what makes each organism different. After allowing my students to partake in many tree observational activities, I permitted them to get more hands-on with pine cones. In this activity, students learned that pine cones provide squirrels with seeds as a major food source. Students were able to pretend to be squirrels by banging the tops of the pine cone on a nearby ledge. This allowed them to successfully harvest a food source and learn the importance of evergreen trees. For this bear crawl extravaganza, my students learned how to measure the height of a tree with just a tape measure. They were instructed to walk backwards while looking between their legs. Once they were able to see the top of the tree, they marked their spot and we measured the distance from the trunk with a tape measure. No ladder required. Another hands-on activity that our students participated in focused on camouflage. 30 red, black, and green puffballs were scattered in a grassy area and a dark area of the forest. Students had to act like predators and catch their prey with a spoon in a set amount of time. In the grassy area, the green ones were rarely caught, and in the dark area, the black ones hid among the shadows. One of the most interesting pieces of information that we as teachers learned in class was the threats to biodiversity. HIPPOC was an acronym that came in handy. Habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, overexploration, and climate change have ultimately led to the future destruction of our planet. This was information that needed to be passed on to students in a way that would motivate change. While exploring the forest in the near distance, our class was able to find an invasive species called buckthorn, which is a major threat to biodiversity. They referred to it as the buck invader, and one of my students even tried to rip off a small branch once I informed him that it harmed and outcompeted other native plants like dogwood. Whether you are inside or outside, teaching with equity in mind is always a factor. Through this class, I was able to work with students with physical and mental disabilities. It always reminded me to provide each student with a necessary amount of instruction, attention, and lesson modifications. Although this class was supposed to be completely outdoors, Mother Nature didn't always cooperate. Some days required indoor activities. When making lesson plans, we learned in class that having a backup or rain day plan was key. As a teacher, one of the most equitable qualities you can exhibit is adaptability. One of the indoor activities that Dr. Faust had the class partake in was called the Web of Life. Dr. Faust assigned every student a different animal and read a story about how each animal relies on one another based on the food chain to survive. While the story goes on, a ball of string begins to connect everyone. While in smaller groups, I led my students through a trophic pyramid activity. Students had to divide up their assigned animals based on the categories producers, consumers, predators, apex predators, and decomposers. The cockroach stumped most of the students. Once back outside, we were able to have students fill out this trophic worksheet based on their own findings. Although moths aren't considered decomposers, this student made a strong argument for it by complaining a moth almost decomposed her wool sweater. If you can start a lesson strong, odds are you can close it with a bang. This class taught me that in order to effectively end a lesson, you not only need to summarize what you learned, but you need to call to action. This is done through sustainability. How can we realistically save the planet? Finally, from this class, I learned the importance of teamwork and reliability. If each teacher in a school works well together in order to complement each other's strengths and supplies knowledge and resources to one another, then a school full of curious, knowledge-seeking students will always be successful.